我们现在开始啊。那个贾老师、林先生、欧阳教授，在座的各位嘉宾啊，各位老师、各位同学，我们今天非常高兴啊，在这里举办这个地域文学贾平凹文学作品国际学术研讨会啊。说到这个贾平凹先生，我们说起来啊。我是大概是70年代末、80年代初的时候就开始读贾先生的作品啊，但是第一次见到贾先生应该是在5年以前，贾先生到静会来啊。那个当时我记得我80年代中的时候就读过贾先生的《黑市》这本小说，当时觉得很震撼，因为在那个时候文坛还是比较左倾啊，就是说他还是左的意识还是比较主导的。那么那个《黑市》呢，它可以说是突破藩篱啊。在当时文坛是引起了相当大的震动啊。贾先生呢，我们这个在这里能开这个研讨会，这是我们一直以来所期盼的啊。那么又特别荣幸，我们请到世界各地的学者来参加这个研讨会，可以说是一时盛事啊。像欧阳教授从美国过来，还有肖教授啊也是从美国过来，还有Carlos 啊都是从美国过来。那么还有那个从日本过来的学者岩崎伸一郎教授啊，那么还有从那个高原啊，从新疆过来的学者买买提先生，还有这个从西藏过来的那个青海过来的龙仁清先生。龙仁清先生昨天晚上我们还聊天啊，他的家住在海拔3000公尺以上啊，3000米以上，可以说让我们高山仰止啊。然后那个还有。这个万马才旦先生也是从青海过来的啊，所以可以说是冠盖云集，济济一堂，一时盛事啊，可以说在静会。那么我们就非常荣幸啊，能够在这里举办这么一个盛会，让大家交流思想，而且作者、作家和学者啊，都共同聚首在这里。那我觉得是很难得的，而且是非常特别的一个会议啊。所以我特别感谢我们的。这个会议呢是由我们中文系、人文和创作系，还有翻译学研究中心3个单位主办的。那么特别感谢我们的同仁啊，在这里付出了很多艰辛的劳动啊。那么而且这个想出这么好的主意啊，在这办这个特别的会议。我想我不占用大家的时间，我们很想听听那个贾先生的高论，还有这个在座各位学者啊和各位作家的高论。我就把时间交给大家，谢谢大家。
好，谢谢我们的文学院助理园长陈继教授。Thanks for Professor Chen, who is the acting dean of Arts Faculty at Hong Kong Baptist University. Good morning. So next, we would like to invite Mr. Lin to give us a welcome speech. 我们请林先生，跟我们说一些话，好不好？谢谢。
我这个本来是中国社科院外国文学研究所的研究员所长，中国外国文学学会的会长陈忠义先生，他有个致辞，就是他收到的静会的邀请函之后，那个。直到26号，那个副总还没下来，所以他就来不了了。他就把他的致辞发到我的邮箱，让我在这边代读一下。他的全文是这么写的：亲爱的朋友，是份贾平凹文学作品国际学术研讨会暨文学与地域。贾平凹书同万马才旦对谈开幕，我仅以中国社会科学院外文所和中国外国文学学会的名义，向各位致以诚挚的祝贺、亲切的问候。同时，我也要对不能与会表示遗憾和歉意。我再一次由衷地感觉到什么叫咫尺天涯。好在会议的主角，我们敬爱的作家朋友没有闪越。如今文学面临困境， 这也是人类的困境。在刚刚谢幕的北京博雅论坛开幕式上，我同诺贝尔文学奖获得者勒克齐奥先生有一个公开的对话的主题，便是全球化时代文学的困境。首先，文学和世界文学依然主要是少数西方大国的文学，尤其是美国化的文学、越南的文学、柬埔寨的文学、缅甸文学等等，并没有什么地位，甚至完全无人问津。中国文学走出国境，也还需要很多路要走，甚至每举步维艰。其次，从泰西英国到远东的日本，中国文学，大学文学乃至整个人文学科正在被有意义的全球化的文化社会主义在资本逻辑和技术理性的助推下势不可当。有鉴于此，我尤其要感谢浸会大学举办这次盛会，它必将在中国乃至世界文学史上留下自己的印记，而不仅仅是惊鸿一瞥。谢谢诸位，祝会议圆满成功，参众于2015年4月26日。
好，谢谢林先生。其实我们是合办，就是我们不是主办，所以应该也非常感谢林先生的杂志帮跟我们一起办这个很重要的一个会议。Well, actually, we are not just this symposium is not just organized by Hong Kong Baptist University. We are co-organizing with the academic journal edited by Mr. Lin for this very significant symposium.
To the first session of the International Symposium on the work of Mr. Jia Pingwa. 今天很欢迎各位来到这儿参加贾平凹先生作品研讨会。In first session, we're going to have two speakers. The first will be Professor Eoyang. Professor Casey Low has very kindly agreed to respond to the presentation. As my colleague Dr. Jessica Young had said, the presentation will be given in English, so please feel free to get the headset if you need simultaneous interpretation. Okay, I think we'll just wait a bit. Okay. Right. So 我简单先介绍一下今天讲者的简历。好，Professor Eugene Eoyang is Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature and of East Asia Languages and Cultures at Indiana University, and Professor Emeritus of English, Translation, Humanities, and General Education at Yunnan University. He specializes in areas of comparative literature, translation theory and practice, Chinese literature, Chinese-Western literary relations, globalizations, cross-cultural studies, and literary theory. He is the author of The Transparent Eye, Translation Chinese Literature and Comparative Poetics, Coat of Many Colors, Reflections on Diversity by a Minority of One, Borrowed Plumage, Polemical Essays on Translation, as well as Two-Way Mirrors, Cross-Cultural Studies in Globalization, and last but not least, the promise and premise of creativity, why comparative literature matters. He's also the translator of Ai Qing's poetry and co-editor with Lin Yaofu of Translating Chinese Literature. 欧阳真教授是国际知名的学者，他是美国印第安大学比较文学及东亚语言文化荣休教授，香港岭南大学英文翻译人文学科及通识教育荣休教授，研究范围包括比较文学、翻译理论及实践、中国文学、中西文学关系、全球化、跨文化研究、 幻化研究、文化理论等等。代表著作包括《透明之眼》翻译中国文学及比较诗学，多色外衣、一人小众对多元的反思，气来之语几篇具争议性的翻译研究论文，双面性全球化下跨文化研究，创意的可能及基础，为什么教文学如此重要？他亦是爱情诗歌的译者，给予林耀福合编翻译中国文学。So without further ado, I give you Professor Eoyang.
Thank you, Professor Yang. 我真的呢荣幸有这个机会参加这个讨论会，而且也看贾先生的这么好的作品，有机会谈到这个，尤其是他的长篇小说，实在是一个很愉快的事。今天有2个困难，一个是我有一点伤风，所以我的喉咙有一点不好听，我是非常抱歉。第二个这个设备有一点问题，本来是应该把我说这个 slides 放在你的这种每一个人有的，但是那个可能不行，因为他们对这个我这个 Macintosh 不太适合，所以请你看那个 screen。问题是我要把这个灯关掉，但是有人说那个是太阳，你不能关掉太阳，所以稍微不容易看的。All right, I will start my talk, which is Jia Pingwa, the concept of Ren and the reading of fiction. In Shen Zhongwen's novella, 变成, there is a passage in which the ferryman is addressing a local student. Quote, outsiders say there's something about our district that produces outstanding men. Why have we none now? Men who make a name, the ferryman responds. I don't care if we have none of those. We have intelligent, honest, brave, hardworking youngsters. That's good enough for me. So I have the Chinese there. You 是不是说风水? And I don't translate this. Gobat, not Gobat. Kinkley translate this as feng shui, which I think is too trendy. I just said the local region. 风水好应处有大名头的人。我以为这种人不生在我们这个小地方，也不爱识。我们有聪明、真挚、勇敢、耐劳的年轻人就够了。So my talk is to make a point of the difference between 大人 and 大名头的人. Because in my opinion, Jia Xiansheng's novels and fiction are about 大人，不是大名头的人。Excuse me. I wish to point out the difference in this passage and in the ferryman's words between 大名头的人, which I would translate big shots, and the words of the young man, 大人, which Gladys Young translates as outstanding men. True, I have one here. True, the ferryman seems to be saying, we've produced no big shots, but we have produced smart, upright, courageous, and hardy young people, and that's good enough for me. It is my view that Jia Pingwa's fiction, especially his prize-winning novel, 佛照, is a concerted attempt to explore the difference between those who are well-known, 大名头的人, and those who are merely outstanding people, 大人. But even Gladys Young's rendering of 大人, of outstanding people for 大人, doesn't adequately convey the sense of 大人 in Chinese. which really means big person, as opposed to 小人, small people. In life, the small people almost always outnumber the big person by a wide margin, which is why Gladys Yang is somewhat justified in her rendering of outstanding people, quote, for 大人. 大人 refers to those with a big heart, those who are not petty or selfish, whose interests are capacious, beyond personal ambition or comfort, beyond individual achievement and fame, beyond a vision of the world that's limited to the self. One such 大人 is 小水, which I refuse to adopt Howard Goldblatt's translation. He's called a water girl. I don't like water girl. It makes it look like a menial. I would translate it more like brook, 小水. When confronted with a rival from the affections of the most desirable young man in the locality, let's see if I can get, yeah. Jing, Brooke is not beset with petty, self-interested jealousies. She imagines the way Ying, her rival, must feel. When Ying comes to see her because her fiancé, Golden Dog, and the love of Brooke's life has been neglecting her, these are Brooke's thoughts. I have both the Chinese and the English. I'll read the English. She disliked Ying for condescending to her, but she understood Ying's inability to consider the effects of her actions made her what she was. She had come to understand that she was in her sorry state, not because Golden Dog had forsaken her, but because she had lost Golden Dog. Although she was furious at Ying, she had to admire her, all the while dejected over her own weakness and timidity. As she pondered Ying's predicament, she couldn't help sighing, Ying's heart is broken too. Now this ability to empathize and sympathize with someone that you don't like, someone who is your enemy, someone who is your competitor, this to me is the essence of what I will call later on as 人. That Jia Pingwa couches these thoughts almost as interior monologue indicates that Brooke is not voicing these sentiments to elicit social approbation. They are the genuine, uncalculating insights of a magnanimous, big-hearted person, a 大人. Yes, though it is not often recognized, women are capable of being 大人 as well. It is clear that Xiao Shui thinks well of Jing. Listening to him in silence, she thinks, he's thought things out so clearly. And she was struck with the realization that he's not only smart, but sensitive as well. He seemed so casual on the surface, so nonchalant about everything. But he had never missed a thing. Nothing escaped him. 他表面上随随便便的，漫不经心，其实把什么都看到了，想到了。It is the casual demeanor of simple folk which misleads their social superiors into thinking that they are not intelligent. But in reality, and on the contrary, they are alert and insightful. Golden Dog never missed a thing. Nothing escaped him. Like a 大人, but unlike a 大名头的人, Golden Dog hides his light under a bushel. He comes across like a country bumpkin from the mountains, not like a 大名头的人, not like a big shot. The reference to 大人 naturally conjures up its opposite, 小人. But in the Analects, the 论语, the 小人, the small man, is often contrasted with the 君子, which is a designation for the superior person, assumed to be male. But Golden Dog in Turbulence is a 大人, but definitely not a Jinzi. Neither is Xiaosui. Jia Pingwa is exploring a different kind of hero, one that need not be educated or even male. And its depiction of a Daren, a big person, is one who operates from the principle of Ren, which is, and this is my most contentious point, is not, despite centuries of mistranslation, not benevolence, and that doesn't mean virtue. Though Ren can lead to benevolence and it can lead to virtue, it is not any of these. The consequence of being one who sees the world through Ren is that one is always conscious of one's relatedness to other people, which includes the Xiaoren, the small people, who populate our world. Nor is the Daren, the big person, ever mindful that he is not unlike the Xiaoren, the small people, in their proclivity towards ambition, profit, status, power, and self-interest. The Daren, far from separating him or herself from the Xiaoren, the small people, sees how much they have in common. And the insight gained is the interrelatedness of all human beings in the essence of the concept of Ren. Along with this ability to understand other people, those who have Ren are naturally humble. Because being related to all others, they can be no better than other people are. In Jia Pingwa's fictions, there are no purely good people and purely bad people. And the notion of being related to all mankind means that no one is immune to the pettiness of small people. The people who understand Ren works with all kinds of people. Brooks says, Xiaosui says, there are good people, 世上的好人、坏人 傻的晕晕的，让他来也有好处。We can use good people and bad people. We don't force bad people away. When Cai Da-an, a toady, and a sycophant offers to join Golden Dog and his crew, Brooke insists we can put this association with us to our advantage as long as we don't forget what kind of person he is. You use Xiaoren, knowing they are Xiaoren, you don't reject them. The problem with the traditional understanding of Ren as benevolence or virtue is that it undermines the meaning of Ren as a fundamental truth about human beings. That we all derive from two people, and that each of our parents derived from two other people, and so on through the generations. If all our ancestors were distinct individuals, which is highly unlikely, 30 generations ago, that puts us in the Northern Song dynasty, or roughly around 1100 AD, we would have potentially, as many as 1,073,741,824 ancestors. Okay? Now, it is estimated the total population of the world in 1100 AD was only 320 million. So it is not improbable to think that we share ancestors. Somewhere along the line, we share ancestors. The power of the concept of Ren is unlike the arbitrary and unfounded human notions of benevolence and virtue. Ren is an incontrovertible fact. The only exception I can think of is maybe Jesus Christ, okay, if you believe in the Immaculate Conception. Its recognition has several consequences, only some of which lead to benevolence. It may also lead to compassion, consideration, and altruism. Ren reminds us of the fact that all humankind is very probably related, and that no one lies outside the human family. We are all family. James Leger, in his translation of the Mencius, which I find very disturbing, translate 仁者无地. I don't have that. Well, I have this diagram. You see, if you look at, I didn't have time to go beyond the fourth generation, but 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and you go on. It gets bigger with every, and by the time you get to 30 generations, you conceivably could have almost 1 billion ancestors. There are whole populations in each one of us, okay? I mean, unless you insist that all your ancestors committed incest, we have populations in us, in our genes, that represent populations of ancestors. Leger's translation iterates a statement that is blatantly and patently false. Benevolence has no enemies. I think anyone can think of enemies. Benevolence always has enemies. There are a lot of people who hold benevolence as an enemy. The reason I object to this translation is it makes Mencius sound stupid, and I don't think Mencius was stupid. Mencius started from an unalterable truth, and he said, if you remember this unalterable truth, then your behavior should be influenced by that recognition. The only sense in which 仁者无地 is incontrovertible is if we understand that 人 represents a notion that each human being is related to every other human being, or as the popular Chinese saying goes, 四海之内皆兄弟. We believe that. Within the 4 seas, all men are brothers. If all humans belong to the family of man, no one can exist outside the family. What is less recognized in this concept of Ren is that we are related to all humankind. Because if we are involved in mankind, nothing human can be alien to us. Nothing. Even the crazy people who shoot other humans. A notion put forth in the West by the 2nd century Roman playwright who started off as a slave, Terence, when he wrote, Homo sum humani nil ame alienum puto. I am human. Nothing human is alien to me. That is why Mencius insisted that only with a sense of Ren could one govern effectively. Okay? 雅轩之人不偏爱人，即情贤也。Yao Shun, their sense of Ren was dispassionate and even-handed, yet they felt closest to the virtuous. That Mencius intended by Ren a truth of human existence, not an abstraction of goodness invented by human imagination, is evidenced by his statement, 人之事，事亲是也. The reality of Ren is to serve one's parents. That's where the tunis comes. That's the first and unalterable truth. Serving one's parents is no exercise in benevolence. It is a recognition of Ren. It is a recognition of one's indebtedness to 2 people who gave each of us life. There is no way that a benevolent man can govern well. Jimmy Carter was a very good man, very benevolent man. He governed very badly. Everyone, even his admirers, think that he was a lousy president. He was a benevolent man. No one denies that. However, the person who recognizes the fundamental truth that each of us is related to the rest of mankind, and for whom this recognition enables him to relate to to people of all sorts, he indeed is supremely qualified to govern. At the base of this perception is the ethical truth expressed negatively in Confucianism and positively in Christianity. Do not do unto others as you would not want to be done to you, the Confucian part. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the Christian part. Which is why the concept of shu is so important to Confucian ethical thinking. Usually translated reciprocity. I find that translation too neutral. The best explanation of the notion of Ren that I know of exists not in Chinese, but in the words of a 17th century English cleric, John Donne. In his famous Meditation number 17, he wrote, "No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." In 1985, Jia Pingwa wrote a short story, published short story called Artemisia in English, Ai Cao. And he provides a telling author note, which I think is worth quoting in full. And I'll give you the text in English and in Chinese. The fact that he thought it important to include it is significant. He writes, there is a story about a girl who's been dead these 3 years. Her teammates have written to 5 newspapers. I don't like the translation teammates, by the way. They were men who were part of the cadre, in the hopes that they would use her story as an example to others. And 3 reporters have been sent at various times, but they had shaken their heads at the banality of it. She had done nothing outstanding in life and died no heroic death. She was not newsworthy. Last winter, when chance took me there, her teammates, finding that I was a writer, almost begged me on their knees to write about her. I inquired, but found her quite commonplace. It took 2 days living alongside the 63 of them, and they were all men, to motivate me to write about her. I told them that none of the comfortable men and women in the big cities would take anything a writer produced other than as a wild fantasy. However truthfully, I wrote. But every one of them told me, just get it written and have it published, no matter what anyone thought. Someone would be convinced. I had to comply. I can tell Jia Xiansheng, I am convinced. The author note is telling, first because Jia thought it necessary to insert it. Second, because it shows that the author's attitude, or his persona's attitude, toward comfortable men and women in the big cities. Jia Pingwa is clearly the conscience of Shanxi, not in the big city. But the important point is that Jia does not disagree with the 5 newspapers and 3 reporters. He didn't say they were wrong, who refused to follow up on the story. as he says himself, he found the central character quite commonplace. He doesn't see that there's something extraordinary about it, unlike the others, but it's still worth writing about. And according to the note, it was the earnest entreaties of the 63 teammates that compelled him to pursue the matter, and 2 days living with them that hardened his resolve to write about the character. In one of his essays, The Sounds of Night, he wrote, "Those who labor hardest with their hearts are the writers." Well, that's a pretty simple explanation. Let's see if I have. Yeah, here it is. 天下最老心者文人. And it's translated, those who labor most with the heart. And you read this and you don't even look twice at it. But it leaves out so much. Because in the English translation, it makes authors into very sentimental people. In Chinese, Xing is not just heart, it's also mind. So, 天下最老心 is the most working with the mind and the heart, not just the heart. They're not separated. In English, they are, which is too bad for English. What he is saying, that a writer engages more than anyone else both heart and mind. That is why I contend that Jia embodies the principle of shu, which I translate as imaginative sympathy, rather than misleadingly reciprocity, which is a diplomat's word, which is too abstract and impersonal, or forgiveness, which is too subjective and too personal. Jia's fictions are exercises in creative empathy, which is also what he demands from his readers. Shu, which I've rendered as imaginative sympathy, also addresses both heart and mind. Take, for example, Jia's main character, Jing, Golden Dog, in his novel Turbulence, as someone who seduces Yin Ying, the niece of a local party chief, Tian Zhongzhen, which I like to translate Tian, straight and narrow. Perfect party man. In order to enhance his chances of getting a job as a reporter for the newspaper of Zhou City, who has an extramarital affair with Shi Hua, which turns out to be crucial when he appeals to her to help him extricate himself from an unjust, politically motivated incarceration, who exploits the fact that he saved Tian Zhongzhen from drowning, though he cleverly declines credit for the act, who manipulates the local cadre in Dongyang County by deliberately losing to the local cadre in chess. And he persuades him to give him the notes on corruption in the local political scene. Jingo, Golden Dog, is far from being a benevolent man. He is manipulative, calculating, and shrewd. He knows men and he knows women. Jingo, Golden Dog, as a reporter, now realized that the scope for doing good was more limited than it seemed. That's a slight mistranslation. 才明白问题并不是那么简单呀. He's able to impress the local corrupt official, Tian Zhongzhen, for whom he has little regard, but whom he takes pains to understand. He's your enemy, but you try to understand. He's a man. You are connected to him. Tian's approbation reflects on Jingo's ability to read his character. You've got style, Tian says, And that's what you need to get ahead. I've had my eye on you for a long time. You have a quick mind, and you express your views well. You're quite a young man. Even when the other is a good friend, of whom he is very fond, like Lei Da Kong, Jingo is dispassionate rather than kindly. When Xiao Shui says, Da Gong is always hurrying somewhere or another, Da Gong 这个风风火火的心地道善理 and Jingo agrees. 人当然是好人呢，却不再说下去吧。Earlier, when Lei Da Kong tells Jingo that he has donated 70,000 yuan as political capital to a middle school, Jingo has qualms, but he drops the subject, realizing that Da Kong was no longer interested in his scruples. Jingo 没有再问下去，他知道大空现在对他的话不是那么能听得入耳了。He's deaf ear to scruples that are coming, so he just doesn't even mention it. He doesn't even try. He still loves him, but he knows his people. Clearly, Jingo has resigned himself to his friend falling into political snares. So intertwined the relationship between political and capital profit has become, in Lei Da Kong's mind, a lot of people make that mistake. You think political capital and capital, business capital are the same. They're not. I think in mainland China you have that problem right now. Unfortunately for Da Kong, he didn't appreciate the difference between capital profit, which often leads to increased revenue, and political profit, which can lead to, and can in any case be interpreted as, corruption. He ends up badly in prison and the victim of an assassination. Aggrieved as Golden Dog is, he doesn't miss the opportunity to bring down the Tian clan as a result of their role in Lei Da Kong's murder. However, one characterizes Jingo's behavior. In no wise could it be described as benevolent. Canny. Excuse me. Canny, people smart, practical, yes, but Jingo's behavior is anything but benevolent. Nevertheless, at the end of turbulence, it is Jingguo who emerges as the elected county head. It is he who appears most capable of governing. It is he who is able to relate to the most supporters, who practices the principle of Ren. He understands other people, not as other, but as part of himself. It is in this sense that one can understand the statement in Mencius that Renzhi Wu Di, the person with creative sympathies, has no other, because he sees the other as himself. My suggestion is that Jia Pingwa is a novelist who embodies the notion of Ren, which I have interpreted as creative sympathies, empathies. He follows in the tradition of the greatest Chinese novel, one which explores more creative sympathies than any other, the Honglou Meng. Jia pays homage to this masterwork in his characterization of the Buddhist monk, which Goldblatt translates as abbot. I think monk is fine, whom the other characters dismiss as the irrelevant drinking buddy of Han Wenju. Xia Shui's guardian. Cao Xueqing's novel was a breakthrough precisely because its creative empathies included the highest and the lowest levels of society, reflected by the brilliant use not only of literary language, wenyan, but also of the colloquial language, baihua. Jia's Buddhist monk Hershang will remind readers of the, quote, Meiji Taoist monk, unquote, in the first chapter of Cao Xueqing's Honglongmeng, whose seemingly nonsensical ditty, known as the Hao Liao Ge, not only provides the philosophical theme of the novel, but also offers a brief preview of the story. Since the text is well known, I'll offer my own outlandishly colloquial rendering of the ditty. You all know this, it's dandy to be good, but a good time is what we crave. Why are the big shots of the past in a grassy plot, a piss-poor grave? You all know this, it's dandy to be good, but filthy lucre is what we crave. All day we gripe there ain't enough, but when there is, we're in the grave. You all know this, it's dandy to be good, but a pretty wench is what we crave. She tells us she loves us every day, but find someone else who ain't so grave. You all know this, it's dandy to be good. Our kitty's love is what we crave. You'll find lots of dotty parents over the years. How many young'uns are a-sweeping our grave? Jia's monk provides a passage of comparable nonsense when he insists on the plethora of emptiness in Buddhist doctrine. The monk says, 有空者有所谓内空、外空、内外空、有为空、无为空、无是空、性空、无所有空、第一空、空空大空. This is a variant on the same theme as the Hao Liao Ge, for which, thematically, Samuel Johnson's poem, The Vanity of Human Wishes, might well serve as the closest Western counterpart. And towards the end of Turbulence, Jia has Han Wenju, Xia Shui's guardian, invoke the message of the Hao Liao Ge when he says, 人人都说神仙好，可就是酒色财气忘不了. Overtones of the Hao Liao Ge clearly there in the rhyme. The experience of reading Jia Pingwa is akin to the experience of reading the Honglongmeng. It enlarges our creative empathies, our sense of Ren, of being related to human beings who might at first seem very different from us, unless we're from Shanxi, which very few of us are. One might deduce from this observation that all novels embody to some extent the principle of Ren, because reading fiction compels us to identify with other people, to understand different characters. To the extent that fiction writers engage us in different perspectives, forces us to see from different points of view, encourages us to recognize that we are related to other people, that we are all part of the larger human family. Yes, the more fiction enlarges our creative sympathies, the more it reflects the principle of Ren. That's what Bakhtin had in mind when he described the polyphony of the novel. Jia Pingwa's fictions are involved in mankind. Thematically, they harken back to the Honglongmeng, as well as inadvertently to the vanity of human wishes. They may be set in a fictional mountain region in Shanxi, which is no more unreal than Shen Zhongwen's West Hunan, or Mo Yan's Gaomi County in Shandong, or Mario Vargas Llosa's jungles of Peru, or William Faulkner's Yokna-Petofa County, all involving the theme of this symposium, literature and locale. They are about our common humanity. We recognize ourselves in Xiaoshui and Jinggo. Turbulence may be about poor, illiterate, or semi-literate people in the mountain terrain of Shanxi trying to adapt to the post-Mao reforms in China toward the last part of the 20th century. But they describe the difficulties of anyone who is trying to be a good person, who is trapped by the trappings of fame and renown, who is seduced by the blandishments of power and money, and who is deluded by the importance of one's own ego. To read Jia is to realize the difference between Shen Zhongwen's 大人 and his 大名头的人, between the big shots and the really important people. Jia Pingwa takes his place among those authors who took up the theme of humanitas, of human relatedness, or ren, in their writing. More specifically, he joins Dostoevsky of poor folk, the Dickens of Oliver Twist, the Mark Twain of Huckleberry Finn, and the Mario Vargas Llosa's The Greenhouse. In each of these fictions, the author explored a disenfranchised portion of society, whether the destitute in Poor Folk and Oliver Twist, slaves in Huckleberry Finn, or the illiterate and semi-literate clients of the brothels in the jungles of Peru in The Greenhouse. In each of these fictions, an attempt is made to dispel the prevailing notion of the poor and uneducated as unworthy of notice. They counter the dismissal by snobs of the unwashed as uncouth and unrefined. The mountain folk in turbulence are not among the educated, the powerful, or the sophisticated. They are not men and women from the city. They are far from being big shots. But they are intelligent, honest, brave, and hardworking, the Daran of the world, more deserving of notice and admiration than many a celebrity, not to mention so-called aristocrats. They are good enough for the ferryman in Shen Zhongwen's Bianchen, and they should be more than good enough for us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor Eoyang. We'd like to invite Professor Casey Lau to respond to the presentation, please.
Well, thanks for Professor Eoyang's very inspiring and thorough reading of Jia Pingwa's novel. Well, this is a very substantial and detailed kind of reading of certain points. I think it's a great demonstration of how translations could be understood as reinterpretations. And I particularly like the way how Professor Eoyang we translate the term 仁者无地 as a person with creative empathy as no other, because he sees the other as himself. I guess it is a fabulous kind of a very insightful kind of a retranslation, and somewhat even kind of deconstruct the way how we always will look at this term, right? We usually will see it as kind people or people with kindness or benevolence. Then there's no enemy. I guess the whole thing will, in a way, also bring to, well, some kind of a significant theme, well, not just in Jia Pingwa's novel, but also in many, many Greek or classic literatures. But I would like to begin, well, with where Professor Eoyang ends, well, with the term, well, humanitas. And indeed, well, in his abstract, we also kind of arguing that, well, Jia Pingwa is a novelist of humanitas. We know that, well, that's a Latin term, well, used to describe human beings. But since it's Latin, well, we're also aware that there's another Latin term, well, to describe human beings, which is, anybody guess? Well, probably not. Well, anthropos, right? I guess, well, we know about, well, how the term anthropology is originated from this anthropos. Well, we know that, well, for a long century, or maybe more than a century, well, these terms are used to refer to human beings. But through such a distinction between humanitas and anthropos, somehow humans are divided or categorized into two different types, especially in modern 20th century. I guess, or maybe, well, we traced it back, well, to late, well, 19th or 18th, 19th century. Somehow the world, even though human beings are living in the same world, but somehow they are not being treated equally. So humanitas is always a term only reserved to those who are able to produce knowledge, who are able to produce, well, leading, well, kind of technologies, or their affects are far more significant, would be treated as something more important than those who are group of humans, well, who would be categorized as anthropos, well, who somehow only considered as a passive kind of receiver for all those produced by the humanitas. Well, they are on the passive side, on the receiving side. So I guess, well, you know what I'm getting as, well, in the East-West cultural studies, well, somehow humans are divided in an unfair world system into two different kinds of groups. Well, one, most of them would be, well, from Europe, from the West, whereas the other from the West, from the non-West, of so-called the rest. So I guess, well, the way how Professor Eoyang will somehow try to bring in, well, this term humanitas is in a way to try to find the significance, well, the way how Jia Pingwa kind of tried to look at, well, his own characters, well, with such kind of glory. Well, so they have been treated equally. Again, well, they are not seen as anthropos, even though, well, maybe socially or politically, or even culturally, they have been kind of seen as, well, small people anthropos. But, well, in his novel, in the way how he treated his characters, how he looked at, well, the world, well, in which, well, these characters are living, they could be also seen as humanitas. They would be rediscovered as humanitas. Well, so there's one interesting aspect. Well, Professor Eoyang's, well, papers will try to draw our attentions. Another aspect, well, I would also try to call your attention to is, well, the kind of, well, as well, Ren has been translated or has been understood as an interrelatedness of all human beings. So the concept of Ren is no longer restricted to a Confucian kind of notion, I guess, well, because, well, in his presentation, he also brings in, well, the Buddhist ideas. So in that sense, well, it kind of, well, have a strong resonance with, well, the Buddhist idea. Like, well, okay, there's a false dichotomy between self and other, that kind of binary opposition is always considered as illusionary, false, well, in the Buddhist idea. And also Buddhist idea, well, would put great emphasis on, like, well, the equality or connectiveness of all sentient beings. Well, 有情众生, well, they are all equals. Well, so we are, and then, well, we kind of induce, well, to the observation that we are no better than other. Well, we're all equal. Even you're a big shot, well, in the physical world, it does not mean that, well, you are necessarily superior to other beings or other human beings. So that is kind of interesting. Like, in that sense, well, I guess, well, one thing, well, the paper, well, would try to kind of allude to is, well, a great novelist, well, always go beyond all these philosophical streams of thought. Well, they don't care whether it's a Confucian or Buddhist world, as long as they care about the secular world, the secular human worlds, well, and somehow they can get that insight. Well. But here, well, I just kind of questions, well, for Professor Eoyang is that, well, the way how he translate Shu, well, so kind of, well, he said, well, Shu should not be translated as reciprocity, and he translated it as an imaginative sympathy. But I wonder, well, if we kind of blur, and if we find that, well, Confucian and Buddhist idea all blend together, well, in Jia Pingwa's novel, well, can we say, well, Shu or Ren can be also translated as compassion? That is what Xibei, well, that is what the Buddhist term, well, which is often used to this kind of emotions or affects. Well. One last point, well, I will be short, well, I will brief, and then, well, we can open up, well, for further questions and discussions. Well, one last point is about world literature. Since the title of the paper, well, refers to world literature, well, this is something, well, I think, well, the presentation have not, well, kind of fully explored. But I somehow got a hint, well, from the presentation is that, well, there is some sort of redefinition of what it means by world literature, well, through, well, Professor Eoyang's reading of Jia Pingwa's novel. It is not about being translated in many different languages. The way how we usually understand world literature is, oh, world literature has been translated first into many, many different languages. Then, well, it could be circulated widely in the global market. But I think, well, the way how, well, this presentation of Professor Eoyang will kind of implies, well, to us, world literature is more than that. It's not just about this kind of physical expansions of a certain text, well, and then we'll make it more accessible, well, to all different kinds of readers. Well, it is about, well, the awareness of or capability to write about interrelated humanness. That is what it means by world literature. A world that is made by the novel that embraces and embodies all human beings. So in that sense, well, what the kind of message I get, well, from this way how world literature is redefined is that no one singular national culture can fully illustrate humanity. As if shown, well, in the presentations, well, you kind of use many different kind of sources, well, to illustrate, well, what it means by the interrelated humanities. Well, that is what I have said about, well, the presentations. Well,
Thanks very much, Professor Casey Lau. Two questions for Professor Eoyang. The first is to do with the translation of Shu. The second is to do with the notion of world literature. Would you like to elaborate on those two?
You have two very simple responses. In an earlier draft, I did entitle it World Literature because I wanted in some ways to understand Jia Pingwa in the context of other authors, which I allude to at the end of my paper. But as I wrote it, I began to think that the reading of fiction is an exercise in Ren, and this became more dominant. And so I changed the last part of my title to, instead of world literature, I turned it to, and the reading of fiction. Because I think if we read fiction, we have to project ourselves into other minds, other personalities. And I recognized that this has something to do with our ability to empathize with other people. And I think reading great novelists encourages us to do that and improves our ability to empathize with other people. As for the possibility of understanding Ren as compassion, my problem is that if you understand Ren as compassion, my problem is that Mencius was saying something irrefutable. No one can deny the principle of Ren. But people can reject compassion as a goody-goody two-shoes. Virtue, oh, well, I'm not virtuous, I don't care. But even evil people have to recognize they came from two people. Even bad and small people have to recognize they came from two people. This is an incontrovertible human truth. And Mencius builds his ethics from that incontrovertible truth, which is why I have said Ren can lead to compassion, it can lead to virtue, it can lead to benevolence, but it is not any one of those things. That's my distinction, okay? It's more fundamental than benevolence or virtue or justice. It's more fundamental. Because once you recognize that truth, all the other behaviors will emanate from that understanding. Okay?
Thanks very much. Any questions, comments, responses? I've got two questions there. One, Ellen first.
Thank you, Professor Eoyang, for your very interesting talk. I'm interested, this has been asked already, but your translation of Shu as imaginative sympathy, I would like to know more about this, especially the part imaginative. Could you explain a little bit more why you chose imaginative?
Right. I believe that, first of all, as I've said, Mencius' philosophy starts from an incongruent. Nobody can argue the principle of Ren. Now, very quickly, he promotes the idea of Shu as, in some ways, a consequence of Ren. Well, Shu is the ability to see from the other point of view, to see the other not as other but as self. And the reason I understand reciprocity is a convenient translation, but it is a little too bloodless a word for me, okay? Because real reciprocity is not mechanical. It's in the heart, it's in the mind, it's in the imagination. That's why I put my translation of it, I emphasize the imagination. Because you can't figure it out. There's no way that you can understand someone just by deducing what that person is. You have to put yourself in that person's shoes, which is what we do when we read fiction. Okay? So that's why I use the word imagination, because it's less bloodless than reciprocity. Okay? Reciprocity is a policy word that has very little spirit. Okay? And it's not, for me, a human word.
All right, we've got a
Thank
question
you.
from Jessica.
Thanks very much, Eugene. I'm very curious when you talk about Mr. Jia Pingwa's. I'm very curious about what you said about Mr. Jia Pingwa's characters being 仁者.
what?
仁者, people, humanitas, use the concept of humanitas on these characters. I just wonder whether you might find the content of this humanitas changing in Chinese novels of different periods. For example, in Wu Si, May 4th fictions, or in contemporary fictions, or even contemporary fictions, there are different periods. I wonder whether you find this content of the humanitas changing in different periods.
That's an excellent question. My sense is that there are too many contemporary novels that are really disguised autobiographies. And the authors are not really interested in other people. They're interested in other people being themselves. There's a difference. So I talk all about myself, and then when you read my book, you become me. Well, this is the reverse of what I'm talking about. I mean, the thing about Shakespeare, the thing about Jia Pingwa, is when you read him, you are into the character, you're not into him. We know nothing about Shakespeare. We know everything about his characters. Okay? The trouble with a lot of modern fiction is it's all about me. And you meet the author and he becomes a god and he's talking only about himself. How boring can that be? Okay? You're leaving aside the richness of the variety of human beings, and you're talking only about yourself. You may be a fascinating person, but you're only one person. And I think that's a modern trend that I don't approve of. Okay? The fact that it has followers only means that we are creating more and more narcissistic people, okay, who like to think, oh, well, it's good to be me. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not my idea of humanitas. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, but do you find the same situation, the same general phenomenon in novels before the contemporary era? For example, May 4th or even pre-modern era. Do you find the same desire for narrating oneself in novels in earlier periods?
Well, my favorite 20th century novelist is obviously Shen Zongwen. And the reason is that he's able, like every great author, to make me as a reader feel what it's like to be someone I'm not. Okay? And he makes it very clear. Okay? And some of the May 4th movement writings do that. Some of them, I'm afraid, are on a political soapbox. And they try to prove a point, which I might agree with, but doesn't enlarge my empathy. It doesn't enlarge my imagination. I admire works that when I read them, I learn something, and I feel that my world is enlarged. That happens when I read Jia Pingwa. My world is enlarged. I'm deep into his novel, but my world is bigger because of it. And that's my test of a good to great writer. Okay.
I think, people can also just use autobiographical voice. It can just be a mode of storytelling. But my real question is about what literature. I can hear Professor Eugene Eoyang. You see, maybe this is a wrong reading, but there's a kind of optimism in your reading Jia Pingwa 先生的 novels with other class novelists' novels. However, there is a barrier, language barrier, and also there is a problem with the form. So how much confidence do you think that maybe in decades, in 50 years, people will start to read Jia Pingwa's novels? I mean, not just us who speak Chinese, who understand Chinese, but other people. And can they understand the stories that he is telling us?
Let me answer the first question. Yes, of course, there are autobiographies, and there's an autobiographical persona. Samuel Richardson wrote in the first person, but it wasn't him. He pretended to be someone else writing in the first person. That's the difference. The novels I was talking about pretend to be about someone else, but they're about themselves, about the author. Now, as for the optimism, I'm glad you sensed it. I try to be optimistic. Is that I think that when I first started teaching, I had to teach text in languages I didn't know. I felt very guilty about that. And then I made a pact with myself. And the pact was, I could justify my existence if I could convince one of my American students to dedicate himself to the learning of a foreign language. If I could do that with one student out of 100, I would have succeeded. Okay? Because it takes a big commitment. You just can't pick up languages over a weekend because you're learning culture, you're learning experience. Okay. So I think translations are a way of becoming more cosmopolitan, reaching a wider audience. There are those who feel that we are under the hegemony of English. You don't translate in English, you don't get read. Well, that may be true, but let's be practical. Some of the best works against English have been published in English. For example, Edward Said's Orientalism, which changed the scholarly world in 1978, consider how pointless it would have been if he had published it in Arabic. It would have no impact whatsoever. So I think the whole question of hegemony is a lot more complex than people give it credit for. Okay? And I think world literature is the beneficiary of even, and I'll say this daringly, of even bad translations. Why? Because bad translations tell you something is there. I'm not getting it, but something is there. And I believe it's better to know that something is there than not to be aware of its existence at all. Okay? That's my more realistic and pragmatic view. Translation, obviously, is never perfect. But if it points out to something worthwhile, and even when it's bad, and I think some translations of good authors are bad, it at least tells the world there is something there you should look at. That's worthwhile. Otherwise, a lot of people in the West, if it's not in English, I don't know that it exists. I don't care. At least a bad translation points out that something exists you should know about. Okay? Even if it's to improve on this lousy translation.
If it is indeed a bad translation, then this will not convince people. Okay, you Chinese can only write this kind of novels. I'm not saying that Jia Pingwa 先生的 works is bad. I'm just thinking that, you know, actually I'm going to talk about his work. I think actually he's great, but then, you know, he has a special way of writing novels, which might be very different from how the, you know, the classical Western novels are written. Then if there's nobody telling them that or introduce his work, then, you know, people will be totally indifferent. And actually, within America, the other day I was reading the dialogue between President Obama and Marilyn Robinson, a very famous novelist in America. They're talking about, you know, how novels can help people to gain the different perspectives. So, you know, what you just said at the beginning of your speech actually reminded me of their conversation. But in the meanwhile, they were talking about how polarized people are. They were just reading what they're interested in. They're isolated in their own small world. How can you get these people come out of their world to read your novels that, you know, they're totally different?
And if you're saying there are more small people in the world than big people, you're right. That's not a surprise.
It's not small people.
But also, there are also very many lazy people who, they are easily polarized. And politicians know how to do that. And it's very depressing how politicians are able to manipulate the laziness of the populace. How do we fight against that? Well, I think we have to be better teachers. We have to be better teachers. And I've written a book. I don't think teaching has been any good in the last 30 years. It's an outright statement. Especially in literature, I believe that we have not taught students what the uses of literature are, why we read literature, how it can enlarge our minds. We haven't taught. What we have taught is how to be snobs. What's the best author? What's the really elite? And so people will take courses according to how much social status it has. It has nothing to do with education. Literature properly taught is a way of thinking. It's a way of opening up your mind. And it hasn't been taught that way. Okay?
Okay, thanks very much. Any other questions, comments, responses? I myself have got a very, very short question for Professor Eoyang. I was fascinated by your presentation. In particular, if I understand you correctly, it was possible for us to say that Confucius is a cosmopolitan. Confucius as a cosmopolitan, in the sense that
One proviso. It is very provincial with respect to gender.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, definitely. I was actually reminded of one saying in the Analect, which is to deal with the definition of Zen, which has been translated in different ways by different translators. D.C. Lau, for example, translates Zen as benevolence, which is not entirely accurate in the way you you use the term. But there's a saying, 克己复礼为人. So 克己, this relates to your point about egoism. A very important part of this pursuit of moral excellence is to deal with overcoming your sense of self-importance. And the second part of that saying is to do with 复礼, so observing the rites literally, but we can take it in a very, very broad sense to mean that Li is the code of conduct, covering all aspects of life. Not just religious, but secular contexts of our life. So I wonder if you would like to elaborate your notion of Zen as applied to the work of the fictional work of Mr. Jia Pingwa, with reference to this saying. You've said a lot about overcoming the sense of self-importance, being this is the sense of humility, the sense of being related to others. What about the social context?
I grew up in America, and so when I first encountered Confucius, one of the things I had most difficulty with was his emphasis on ritual. Because from an American's point of view, it's irrational. You're not thinking. It should be sincere. Well, I lived in America during the 60s, when there was a lot of sincerity going around. And I much prefer ritual now. Because I went to weddings where people made up their vows, and it was awful. It was awful. And there's something about ritual, which is in some ways the essence of what people have passed down from generation to generation. It's the quintessence of behavior. And when you understand it that way, instead of having every ceremony where people invent what they're going to say, and it's terrible. They think it's great, but it's terrible. Okay? It's not aesthetic, it's not moving, it's sincere, but it's stupid. So I became more appreciative of Confucius's emphasis on ritual. Okay, ritual is what our ancestors handed down to us, and it has a certain sacredness because of the source. Okay, and when we practice our ritual, we are intuitively practicing Ren. Okay, and I began to appreciate that more and more. Instead of when I was younger, I thought, well, ritual, it's insincere, it's ceremonial, it's false, etc. I don't think that anymore.